Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Online, can you hear me? Michele, Nathan? Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. Okay. So today I'm going to present an article on the effect of the Great Recession and the double debt recession in Europe and its effect on health inequalities. First, we look at the unemployment rate and how it has changed over the years following the 2008 financial crisis. We look at Europe and the United States. You can see that unemployment rate rose in both Europe and the United States following the year 2008. However, it is clear that it rose much steeper in Europe and for a longer time. For example, we can see that in the US around 2010, unemployment rate started to fall down. But then in Europe, it stayed until 2016 or 2015, almost before it started to fall down. For that reason, I focus in this article on Europe, since the crisis was more severe. The 2008 economic crisis led to several demonstrations in the European continent. There was a lot of anger, and this was caused because many countries implemented either austerity measures or increased taxes. So the living conditions of people were more difficult. And this happened in several European countries like Greece, Spain, Italy. At the same time, the 2008 financial crisis really led to a political instability in the EU. Greece was about to exit at some point, and this did not happen at the end, but just to give a picture that the crisis had several dimensions. One was on health, other was in politics, and it had also an economic dimension. First, I'll discuss some of the literature on austerity measures. These austerity measures were implemented during the 2008 financial crisis, and they affected health outcomes in different ways. What are some of these austerity measures that were implemented back then? There's two good reviews about these austerity measures, one by Reeves and colleagues, and the other one by Karanikolos and colleagues. Some of these measures were staff reduction in the healthcare system, reduction in benefits and services, increased patient costs, and a decrease in the funding in the infrastructure and equipment maintenance. First, I discuss some of the studies about the 2008 financial crisis and its effects on health, some of the negative impact of the crisis, some of the positive impact of the crisis. Then I discuss some of the mechanisms, why scholars argue that there are some negative or positive outcomes, and how it can be disproportionate effect on the low or the high educated. So we'll start with the literature on the worsening outcomes. And this is specific to the 2008 financial crisis. Studies found that suicide increased in Austria, Finland, France, Germany, and some other European countries. This was the case also when we look at outcomes such as depression and separated health. These worsening outcomes happen in several different countries. However, surprisingly, the literature is mixed and there's no consensus. If we look at other studies, sometimes that looked at the same countries or the same outcomes, we can see that in several different countries, some health outcomes were also improving during that period. For example, if you look at depression, there's a comparative study in 21 countries that found that depression decreased during that period. Similar for mortality, the mortality outcome is not also about the economic recession in 2008. There's a long line of literature that shows that mortality is countercyclical. During economic boom, there's high rates of mortality. During economic recessions, there's lower rates of mortality. And finally, there's also mixed evidence on separated health. Many people experience better separated health. So one question here arises, how is it possible that there's so much mixed evidence? It's hard to say. One can argue that some of these studies use different estimation strategy or different operationalization of some of the outcomes, or maybe different sampling when they're looking at the population. Even though there's not a very good explanation about why there's mixed evidence, it's important to put it upfront before we delve into the mechanisms. So what have the scholars argued, like why an economic recession is bad for you? The obvious first major mechanism is stress. Stress can happen during a financial crisis due to job loss. As unemployment rate rise, many people lose their jobs and they suffer to make ends meet. This has been shown by different studies in the past that a job loss, beside the financial strain that puts on individuals, it has other dimension as a loss in self-esteem. Also, people lose their routine. For these different reasons, people do suffer from stress when they lose their jobs, and this shows that it kind of can inflict chronic illnesses, but also depression and other mental health issues. At the same time, during an economic recession, people who are near retirement, they experience an early exit, a permanent exit of the labor market. When we compare them with people who are near retirement during an economic boom, who loses their jobs during that period, they experience the job loss differently. And we can imagine if someone loses their jobs and exits permanently from the labor market without anticipation, this also can affect their health negatively. Finally, there's self-perceived economic insecurity. Even for many people who keep their jobs during an economic recession, just seeing a massive layoffs around them also affects their health. Besides that, they feel insecure. Many companies raise demands on employees during financial crisis. And this also leads to different health hazards. The second main mechanism is reduced access to healthcare and medication affordability. As we had discussed before, with austerity measures, many governments reduce access to healthcare, and we can imagine that many respondents or individuals, they cannot access healthcare and they miss a lot of routine, or there's delayed diagnosis that in that case. All these different hurdles that are related to health and the healthcare system also affects individuals and can create chronic illnesses or other health problems that can be seen later on following a crisis. Now one can ask, how is it possible that an economic recession is good for you? What's the main mechanism here? Several studies have shown that during the 2008 financial crisis, people who lost their job, what were they doing in the additional hours they had? Many people cooked healthy meals, they slept more, and they exercised more. Of course, one can imagine that this is not specific to the whole population. One can imagine that there's different mechanisms playing for different subgroups in the population. We can imagine if someone has a high education and a good job, even if they lose their jobs, they can actually benefit a bit more from it because they have less strain worrying about money, or also they can still afford healthcare, for example. So in that sense, the more time for leisure, we can think about it in a way that it's not specific to the whole population, but maybe to some subgroups of the population. Previous studies also showed that there are fewer accidents in an economic recession, whether these accidents happen on the roads, like motor vehicle accidents, but also at the firm level. So in the same time, also this is why people die less during an economic recession. There's less consumption of alcohol and tobacco. This has been corroborated by different studies in the past. Obviously, this reflects well on the health of people. However, some of these studies found that while the average of consumption decreased for the population at the whole, it has increased for some subgroups of the population. And these people were the ones most affected by the crisis. And we can imagine that as a coping stress, many people binge drinking and with alcohol and smoking, but this is only particular to some subgroup of the population. But on average, there's a decrease in consumption of alcohol and smoking, and this improved health outcomes. Finally, there's less pollution. Previous studies showed that cardiovascular diseases, they decrease during the financial crisis, and this is related to less traffic jams, but also less production, and this kind of affects the pollution in that sense. Similar to the main effect that I discussed before, while there's some studies that shows negative effect of an economic recession on health and positive effect on health, there's studies that shows that there's a disproportionate effect for the lower educated. But there are also other studies who shows otherwise. So there's also mixed evidence. And maybe you wonder why I focus specifically on the education outcome as a predictor here, because in people who study health, there's a consensus that it's one of the major predictor. And for that reason, as a stratification group, most studies look at education as a certification outcome. So there are some studies that looked at outcomes such as self-rated health and diabetes in some European countries, and they found that for the lower educated, they experience more self-rated health issues and diabetes prevalence. There are other studies, as I discussed, that shows no difference between both groups. So there's no change in self-rated health or in emergency visits. So what's the motivation of this article that I'm presenting here today? The main motivation is that some of the studies I discussed are case studies. There are maybe others that are comparative studies, but these comparative studies are not longitudinal. And all of the studies I discussed, they focus on a period that is between 2008 and 2010. As I have showed in the first graph, this period, at least when we look at Europe, it's only at the beginning of the crisis. It showed the beginning of the crisis in Europe. And if we look on some other European countries here, we can see that following 2008 until the double dip recession, it only peaked in the double dip recession. And not looking at the period following 2011, I argue that at least in Europe, we miss a good part of the crisis. So the major reason behind this article is that it focuses on 29 countries, it uses longitudinal data, and it focuses on a period that other studies have neglected. And in that way, I hope to contribute to the literature on health inequalities during the financial crisis and the double dip recession. There are two main research questions here that this article asks. The first one is whether the 2008 financial crisis changed the gap in health between the low and the high educated. And the second one is whether austerity measures changed the gap in health between the low and the high educated. To answer these research questions, I use the EU Silk. It's a longitudinal design with the rotational groups. I look at the periods between 2005 and 2015. And I observed 29 European countries. The main focus is on working adults that are near retirement and that are aged between 50 and 65. Why do I focus only on people who are aged 50 and 65? The main reason is the outcome, which is chronic illness. We know from the literature on health that generally people only start showing chronic illnesses around the age of 50 on average for the population. Of course, it can happen before then, but generally for the population, chronic illnesses starts at the age of 50. And for that reason, I focus on people above this age and who are in the labor market. What's the question that is asked for the respondents? It's very simple. Did you experience any illnesses that has been lingering for longer than 6 months? The data producers, they know that people have different access to medical care facilities. And they accepted self-report for this question because they didn't want to bias the sample. In a sense, only rich people could access self-diagnosis if they go to a doctor. And then if they only accept the diagnosis from the doctor, then they have difference in the socioeconomic status response. So it's a self-report measure of people who said yes to the question. A limitation here is that we don't know what kind of chronic illness do people have. It could be a mental health disorder, diabetes, cardiovascular, chronic respiratory, autoimmune. So it could be many different things. And this is a limitation that we cannot go more into the outcome. We cannot know what kind of illnesses these people have, but we do know that they experience more illnesses. The main predictor here is educational groups. The low educated people are people who have less than upper secondary. The high educated are people who have more than tertiary education. For the macro variable, to measure the recession, I look at macro unemployment rate, and to measure the austerity measures, I look at the health expenditure as percentage of the GDP. I control for age and gender. This is the rotational design of the EU Silk. The EU Silk follow people only for 4 years. They learn from other data sources that attrition rate is very high the longer you follow individuals. In order to avoid this limitation, they only follow people for 4 years. And every year, there's a new sample that enters for another 4 years. And as you can see here, with time, each additional sample enters, and there's another subsample that exits. Here are the countries of the data. In black, it's all the period covered. So we can see, for example, in Bulgaria, Czech Republic, Greece, Malta, the first wave is missing. And for Croatia, Luxembourg, and Romania, there are a few then a module that is missing. But for most of the countries here, we can see that the whole period is covered. So what's the estimation strategy? I use cross-classified multi-level model. In a popular paper used by Schmidt and Katran and her brother, they argue that for multi-level models, this strategy yields the least biased results. And what's the advantage of this analytical strategy? As all multi-levels, it recognizes that people in one country are different than people in another country. On top of this, the model recognizes that people in a certain country and in a certain year, Greece 2005, people who reside in Greece in 2005 are different than people who reside in Greece in 2007. So the model kind of recognized the country year dimension. And at the same time, the model recognizes that people who reside in a certain year, regardless of the country and the country year, are different than people who reside in another year. So taking these three dimensions into account, the model can take these as a starting point. First here is the descriptive results for the 29 countries. We looked at there's a general trend of increasing prevalence in chronic illness between 2005 and 2015. However, we can see that it is steeper for the low educated compared with the high educated. There's a 5 percentage points increase for the low educated, and there's around 3.5 for the high educated. So this is for the 29 European countries in the data. Now I move to the results of the cross-classified multi-level models. This is the predicted probabilities of chronic illness by education and within unemployment rate. On the y-axis is the prevalence of chronic illness. On the x-axis, it's the change in unemployment rate from one year to another. So this model, it does not show whether a certain countries like Italy that has a high rate of unemployment compared to Germany who has a low rate of unemployment, how this affects the prevalence of chronic illness between different education groups. It shows whether a change in macro unemployment rate from one year to another would change the prevalence of chronic illness for the respondents from one year to another. On the x-axis is the change in unemployment rate. When it moves from 0 to -2, unemployment rate is falling, and when it moves from 0 to 2, unemployment rate is rising. So what we can see here is that the higher the unemployment rate, which kind of indicate the higher is the crisis, the larger is the gap between the low and the high educated. So there's more gap in chronic illness between both. What's interesting here is that the slopes are in opposite direction. So for the high educated, chronic illness decrease when there's an economic recession. For the low educated, chronic illness increase. If you go back to the mechanisms that we discussed early on, here it could be a typical example. How is it possible that an economic crisis can have different impact for different subgroups of the population? Of course, the mechanisms that we discussed, they are not present in the data, and these are also very difficult to have in other data as well, but we can kind of imagine that they can play for different subgroups differently. Now we move to the austerity measures. It's the predicted of chronic illness by education and within health expenditure. As with the previous slides, on the y-axis is the prevalence of chronic illness, and on the x-axis, it's whether the expenditure is falling or rising from one year to another. If it moves from 0 to -1, it means that there's more austerity measures, and if it moves from 0 to 1, governments are more spending on healthcare. As we can expect, the more governments spend on healthcare, the lower is the chronic illness. So for both, the prevalence of chronic illness decrease with more spending on healthcare. However, it is much steeper for the high educated compared with the low educated. What this means? It means that the high educated are much more sensitive to government spending on healthcare. One can imagine that a good explanation, because the high educated have more access to healthcare, maybe they have the know-how to take care of themselves in a better way, and for that reason, they're more sensitive to a change in spending on the healthcare by the government. unlike the people who are low educated, who are less sensitive to this measure. Here is the table of these results. It's not the whole table, it's some part of the coefficients. What I just showed in the figures, these are the low education times within unemployment rate and the low education times within health expenditure. For the medium education, when we compare them with the high education, there's no difference. So the crisis had no difference between these two groups. For the low educated times between unemployment rate, the between unemployment rate is comparing countries who have high level of unemployment with countries who have low level of unemployment. So not the change from one year to another, just looking at whether a certain initial level of unemployment rate or of health expenditure has a different association on the prevalence of chronic illness between the low and the high educated. For both of these measures, we see that there is no association. So it doesn't matter whether a certain country had initially a high level of unemployment rate or a low level of unemployment rate or high expenditure on spending of healthcare. What mattered is whether this macro level has changed from one year to another. We can see here also that males experience a lower level of chronic illness compared to females. However, with another model that I ran, it shows that during the economic crisis, this gap has decreased. And mainly the explanation is that the 2008 financial crisis affected industries that are male dominated, such as the construction industries or the manufacturer industries. So this gap that is between male and female, where male experience less chronic illness, it decreased over time, and especially following the financial crisis. Finally, to discuss the robustness of these models, first, I ran fixed effects on the individual level and the country level, like a two-way fixed effects, because this affect, like you can control for unobserved heterogeneity over time for individuals. To measure the economic recession differently, I use the change in GDP growth over time. And for the austerity measure, since it was a surprising finding for me at the start, I wanted to double check with several different measures. I used the total expenditure for a country, the social protection benefits, old age benefits, and disability benefits. For all these four different austerity measures, only the disability benefits is not statistically significant. All the other three goes in the same direction as the findings that I have showed. And finally, for excluding, I excluded the largest 8 countries, each one at a time, from my models to see whether one country is driving the result as an outlier. So all these robustness checks, the fixed effects, the other recession measurement, all of them, they do lead to exactly the same findings that I showed in the previous slides, with the only exception of the disability benefits for the austerity measurement. Thank you for listening, and please feel free to comment or to ask any question you have.
Can you go back to your main results?
Yes, the table or the...
Yeah. I was wondering, maybe as a robustness check, can you control the base year's health status interacted with like year dummies to control the like trend to control the like year trends of the health status change, even without the unemployment changes, or without the effect from
So the interact the dummies,
with
the year dummies with
the
the
base year's health status,
the initial
initial.
right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Can now put some notes. Yeah, I haven't tried this, but you would think that the initial year could influence the.
No, I don't know. So I look at the informal care quite a lot, and recently I was particularly interested in this topic because I'm writing something about the how informal care received and giving reacts to the unemployment rate,
Okay.
the recession, still clarity. But for informal care, I think the endowment, like a elderly person can receive from his offspring or spouse is certain. Like if you have a bigger family, probably you receive more informal care than others. And that initial status matters. But here, I was thinking for example, for a low educated person, probably the health status, health outcome measures is lower than more educated person, even without this change, and the trend should be maybe different or maybe the same.
Okay.
Without the effect of employment.
Thanks.
So have you ever thought about the relationship between, like the actual relationship between healthcare spending and chronic illness? So obviously within the time period you're talking, you know, like a few years in terms of actually, you know, decisions on healthcare spending to affect whether or not people develop chronic disease is quite small, and especially in the age range you're looking at older adults, where like the risk factors are probably more established in younger adulthood. But I wasn't sure what's your interpretation of this model and the findings?
So how this would affect for younger people, you mean?
Well, I think like kind of in terms of relationship between like the relationship you're describing between unemployment and chronic illness, like what's your interpretation of the relationship between them?
So in a sense, why an increase in macro unemployment rate would increase the level of chronic illness?
Yeah.
I think there could be different mechanisms, but one is job loss, as I discussed during the mechanisms, like operated through stress, right? So chronic stress lead to chronic illnesses. You can imagine just if you think you're depressed, you would answer yes to this question, because if you have been depressed for a few months, there's an illness lingering, and if people from lower educational groups experience more depression than people from higher education group as a result of the job loss, then you would expect them to have more chronic illnesses. It seems go with the maybe binge drinking or increase in smoking, that this also goes up for some specific subgroups during a financial crisis. And this also could disproportionately affect the lower educated compared with the higher educated. In several models I looked at whether specific, without looking at the macro values, whether like at the individual level, whether if you lost your job during that period, how this would affect your chronic illness, or whether you had an early exit from the labor market, permanent exit to the labor market, also how this would affect. So I have data on some individual at the individual level. And these, for example, they do show that chronic illness increased sharply for the people who had these experiences.
So this is a really interesting paper. This is a bit of a kind of nitpicky thing, but so the incidence of the chronic illness has to happen at least 6 months prior for it to turn up in the year. And from memory, I don't think your equation had like lagged changes, so between T-2 and T-1 as a thing there. But actually, in conceptually, the thing that is actually meant to happen is you go into the unemployment causes reduced health in T-1, and the change should actually be from T-2 to T-1, even though you're measuring the 6 months of illness in T, if that makes sense.
So you're saying that I should have lagged the 1 year earlier, the macro unemployment rate.
I think so. I'm not sure whether it would give you better results, but conceptually, if what we're talking about is in time T, do you report having had an illness for at least the past 6 months, then the actual event that you care about happened 6 months ago. Although obviously the time in between, you might recover something like depression if you were able to go back into a job.
I ran some models for the lagged,
Yeah,
and what you can see, whether you lag with 1 year, 2 years, or the confidence intervals become so large that there's nothing anymore in the models. So there's much more noise once you lag in 1 year or 2 years. I cannot, it's a very good point, but I cannot say why there's more noise once you lag by 1 or 2 years, but probably it's not catching whatever we think it could catch with a lag. But it's a good point.
and I had a very similar question on the same thing, which was about the austerity measure.
Yeah.
And it looked like all of your austerity measures were indexed of GDP, so reported as a fraction of GDP.
Yes.
If you have somewhere like Greece that has pretty substantial cuts to health expenditure or other social expenditure, but also falling GDP, that to an extent is underplaying what is the real impact of the austerity there. Healthcare systems have different levels of efficiency and to some extent adapt to the amount of funding they have. And then when you cut, that's a really visible point of difference. I don't know if having just kind of absolute health expenditure per capita or
It's a very
health
good point.
expenditure per
Yeah, it's a very good point.
wage over the prior 10 years or something would get around that. Because it might be like muting a little bit of your overall effect.
So these, not this one, sorry. These one are the absolute values, not the percentage it has, the one I showed in the models. These are per each inhabitant, and they're controlled for like inflation. So it's how much each person spend, each country spend per person, and they're controlled for the inflation for the prices over the years, but not with the main, not with the percentage cuts in GDP. Yeah, but it's also you said you can average it out.
Yeah, well, you could just say as a percentage of, I don't know, yeah, pre-crisis GDP or as a percentage of projected GDP absent crisis or something like that.
That I didn't do the averaging, but
Just because, yeah, then you do have these two things moving at the same time.
but it's a very good point. I also thought about maybe I should remove it as the main predictor from my model and instead include one of these as in the main paper and not under robustness. But then I thought it's just because it's a wider measure, you know, like the percentage of health, the health expenditure as percentage of the GDP, which kind of shows all health benefits that people can have access to in a certain country. That's why I kept it as the main measure in the model.
I think it's conceptually good, but I just think so. Like if you thought about in the case of the UK, NHS spending in absolute terms went up and was pretty ring fenced, and as a percentage of GDP definitely went up because GDP went down. But social care was up really, really drastically, and NHS spending didn't go up as much as it would have in the kind of non-crisis counterfactual. And so you'll have something that looks like actually the UK did quite well and had increased health spending. But if you talk to anyone who was working in health, that was not what was going on in terms of all of the actual mechanisms of people's health.
Okay, thank you.
Do point out the countries in which these core correlations were the strongest. I mean, for example, where the well-educated people gained the most from the financial crisis.
So these are the 29 countries. I split them to two tables. You want me to go back to the other one? Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So it's really in a way very random. There is no clear patterns. Like even with the countries that experience the most deep crisis, like let's suppose Greece, Italy, Spain, they don't always have the same trends. For example, Portugal here, you could see the high educated following the crisis, they experience lower level of chronic illness compared to the low educated. For Italy, the low educated experience more chronic illnesses compared to this is Italy here. But it's not so large, the difference between both. In Greece, which is EL here, we can see that the gap decreased. It stayed stable for the high educated, but it decreased for the low educated following the financial crisis. And so this is over time, but as you can see, it's a bit random. So that's why I ran the results in multi-level models, because it tells you whether a change in a macro variable after accounting for the year dummies, it tells you whether a change in the macro variables will affect the outcomes across all countries on average. Yes.
Why did you choose chronic disease as dependent variables?
That's a good question. I think many of the studies focus on separated health, and very few ones focus on chronic disease. The ones that focus on chronic disease, it was a specific kind of diabetes or cardiovascular diseases. And it's not often common in data that you have information about a chronic disease. So I thought in a certain way, as most of the studies, they focus on self-rated health, I thought it could be a good addition to the literature to focus on chronic disease, but also because chronic diseases are costly for the system and they are very relevant. Like they predict a longer health span, I would say.
And your dependent variable, sorry, I missed that. Like, it's the probability, right?
It's
The extensive margin.
it's a question they ask for respondents. Have you been ill?
Yeah.
For more than 6 months? Is there any lingering illness? And if respondent says they say yes, then it's a yes. If they say no, it's a no. So it's binary variable. But here, because people can tell me, but what do you mean if you have been sick? Like what kind of what do the respondents expected with this kind of question? And if you read in the notes and they say it's a chronic illness. So they, in the sense, the respondents were asked whether they had a chronic illness in the past 6 months and whether it has lingered. And if they said yes, they were yeah. But here I mentioned a limitation of the outcome, which is that a chronic disease can be many different things, but I just cannot say which one is which.
Okay.
So this is the problem of this outcome, is that you cannot know what specifically is going on with the chronicness. Yes,
So it's great. Do you have the outcomes presented by like category of chronic illness, for example, like seeing how much is driven by mental health or how much is driven by chronic pain, etc.?
unfortunately not. I wish, I think it would have been even be much more interesting if you could check which of these categories is, let's suppose, more sensitive to a financial crisis or not. But unfortunately, I do not have this. Yes.
Do you have alternative definitions of like the inequality variable? So can you run stuff based on income or something like that, as opposed to, or even like racial categories?
You mean instead of using education, I look at different quartiles of income groups?
Yeah.
I could do this. I haven't done it, but I would expect to see similar results just because education and income are very correlated together.
Yeah.
But do you have a hunch about why it could be more or like what?
The thing for me is that the relationship between kind of education and social status, I would imagine, is very different across Europe and very different over time. So if you're talking about people who are 50 to 65 in 2005 to 2015, that they are doing maths in my head, but they went to university in the 80s or something, when the relationship between, you know, income and social mobility and education were changing very, very rapidly. And I can't quite work out in my head whether that's relevant to your time series, but I would think, you know, that the social indication of someone who went to university in the 90s versus went to university in the 70s is very different as well. So you would expect that effect to change over time. So it's not so much that I think it's bad, because I think it is quite hard to keep track of like income quartiles of people losing their jobs or losing their businesses or whatever. But I could see issues with it as well.
So in that sense, I think it's a good proposition, because I would expect to see even a stronger association, like a stronger relationship between income groups and economic recession, because in a sense, the higher, I think if you look at people with high education across Europe, there's a lot of variation, as you were saying. If you look at their incomes, so if you look at the people with high education, the lowest bound and the highest bound could be large, but then if you split it by income quartiles, then you really kind of have the richest. And yeah, I haven't done it, but I think it's a good proposition. Thanks.
The other thing I was wondering, I don't know about this survey, but the biggest impacts of unemployment stuff during that period were like young people. And obviously they don't have as high rates of chronic illness, but when they do, it's much, much more likely to be mental health. And they also have much, much more likely to be unemployed. And I don't know if you run it and it's pure noise because the outcome's not enough. But
I did for young people. So for chronic illness, it actually decreased for the young people, for everyone. So the gap doesn't change between the low and the high educated, but it goes down for all the young generation. When I look at separated health for the young generation, the gap increased between the low and the high educated.
As in it did find an effect of self-rated health, but not for chronic health.
Yes. But since the papers are already large, I decided again to just focus on chronic illness, old people, call it a day, because otherwise there's no space to. With the 8,000 limitation.
No, that's very reasonable. But it sounds like a really interesting. I mean, I think there's probably more to do in the young people stuff than as a separate paper.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I echo the same sentiment with mental health, but it's because you cannot really disaggregate. Chronic illnesses, you cannot disaggregate between mental health and, for example, chronic kidney disease. What's really carrying that particular situation.
Yeah.
Yeah, not by the problem, because with mental health, expect something in younger people and also with autoimmune conditions.
Yeah.
That's where, CKD, that expect like cardiovascular diseases, yes.
Did you look at the effects by age groups? Like
Sorry?
50 to 55, 55 to 60?
No, I didn't. So divide the age groups, you mean?
Yeah,
I didn't. Do you expect that the, let's suppose, like, should I run this the same differently for the different age groups and see whether the slope is more sensitive?
at least for me, following his idea, like the effects to a person who is 50, for example, he's working age, he needs to provide care to childcare or probably parents informal care. Compared to a 65 person might be very different, and the education's premium on protecting them from chronic disease might be different. I would see that. Maybe, as you said, your paper is already very long, like write a footnote or something. I was interested in looking at the aging profile of the effect.
Yeah, I mean, I control for age, so this is
Yeah.
control for age, but I don't run it by different age groups too. But it's a good proposition.
So I think like building on that, it's interesting the difference between self-defined chronic illness and self-defined health. Because I think especially for young people, you would imagine that in an area where you can decide whether or not you're depressed or just unhappy, which is obviously not exactly how it works, but there's always a bit of a borderline. It's like that will be defined a lot in relation to your job, whether you think of yourself as someone who has to have like a diagnosable condition to not go to work as opposed to just, you know, being depressed at home. And that whether yet you would find different effects even within that 50 to 65 band of like people who have already left their job by the time the crisis hits, and it's a bit more about their experience of their health directly as opposed to whether they'd be expected to go to work with the condition.
Yeah, it's a good point. Probably for another day.
I'm also very interested in seeing some like placebo analysis here, although I cannot come up with a good idea. Something really can be, something is convince us that this only attributes to the unemployment rate changes other than other macro, I don't know, I'm sorry.
Did the relationship hold in non-crisis times, maybe?
Crisis times, yeah,
In non-crisis time.
exclude the
Because
crisis times.
I think this takes both into account, right? Like this is a non-crisis time.
But the main source of variation is the crisis, really, isn't it?
Yeah, the change in the crisis.
Yeah.
But in non-crisis time, there's very little variation in the change of the macro unemployment rate. So in a sense, you're testing no change in a macro variable compared to a change in an outcome, right? So I suppose macro unemployment is 10 in year 0, it becomes 10 in year 1. You wanted to check whether
Well, it was more like, so say you're talking about 2005 to 2008, it'd be like going from 4 to 5% as opposed to 5 to 15%. But I suspect, yeah, you just wouldn't find anything, would you?
but this would average. So for example, this model would average the going from 5 to 10
Yeah,
in a certain country and another country going from 5 to 8, how this would affect so what you see here is the average of the intensity of the crisis.
yeah.
This is what this model shows. But I would say that it also shows whether there's no change. So let's suppose there's in 2005, its unemployment rate is 10, and it's also 10 because you have 29 countries. So you have countries where there's no change in unemployment rate. This is also included in the model. If unemployment rate stays stable, and there was an increase in chronic prevalence, this would also catch it up. So it would tell you whether it was really the association or not.
I think still his suggestion tell us something. Sorry, I was late. Your title has like Great Recession.
Right.
But if there was no Great Recession, like, still can we see the change?
How,
Then the disparity between these two educational groups, their response to chronic, the chronic disease to respond to the disparity in education experiences is only attributed to Great Recession, or it happens like all the time?
and how do you suggest like one can, like you look at different years or?
I was thinking like excluding recession periods, but I don't know.
So my thinking was, so is whether you find at a macro level the relationship, so because the inequality is really the outcome here that you're interested in. It's like the extent to which there's,
Yeah,
and the extent to which that varies with unemployment rates. I guess my thinking was whether that, like, the Great Recession reflects a kind of exceptional time in the relationship between unemployment rate and inequality. Because it's not like, if you look at that it's not big movements in unemployment rate, but there are real movements in unemployment. And there are still real movements in unemployment. I mean, COVID messes with stuff generally, but the question is like what that coefficient is. If you split up the sample,
so if you look, for example, between 2005 and 2009.
you should get a different, like the coefficient that you've got in your study should be the average of the coefficient across that whole period.
Right,
And it might be much higher or much lower during the recession itself, because that reflects a kind of special relationship between unemployment and inequality.
right. So you'd be kind of interested just running it on a shorter period that
Yeah.
doesn't have this kind of variation to see whether it holds or not.
Yes, so because sorry, I'll stop talking.
Oh, it's fine, it's fine.
No, so I remember doing a thing on like relationship between a cartel and truck prices for like competition thing. And the question was whether the relationship between, you have your outcome, which is prices, and you have your exposure, which is cartelization rate within this industry, is to some extent, you can run all of it all together, but you might expect there to be a different relationship during this specific period. And the question is, have you used the Great Recession as a source of big variation in unemployment rates to understand the overall relationship between unemployment and inequality in health? Or have you isolated the specific impact of the Great Recession on inequality in health? And they're both really interesting questions, but it's just a question of which one.
Okay. Yeah, oh, it's a good point. Yeah, here, yeah, all the period is included, but should be worth looking at like at least specifically 2005 to 2008 before the crisis really, or 7, because after that period, as you can see, it started to really have a variation.
Or if the reviewer asks the question, you can do that.
Yes, yes. Okay, I think we are about time. Thank
It's
you.
really interesting.
No, I'm in psychology.
Thank you for the people who attended online. Have a good day.
Yeah.
Huh? I don't know. I can do it. Huh?
This is a bit weird, isn't it?